The storm came without warning, rolling across the countryside like a beast awakened from slumber. Thick, roiling clouds devoured the twilight, leaving behind an oppressive darkness that wrapped itself around Ethan Caldwell's modest home. The rain struck the tin roof in relentless bursts, drowning out the usual comforting hum of the house's old systems. Ethan was at his desk, half-heartedly tinkering with a dismantled servo unit, his hands moving on instinct while his mind wandered. It was supposed to be just another quiet evening, a retreat into his familiar world of circuits and solitude. But then he heard it, a sound that didn't belong. A thud. Faint, muffled, and irregular, it came from below. Ethan froze, his fingers tightening around the tiny screwdriver in his hand. The noise came again, a hollow percussion that seemed to pulse with the rhythm of his own heartbeat. He turned his head toward the narrow door leading to the basement, a space he rarely entered these days. The wind howled outside, but it was the silence that followed the thud that unnerved him most. Ethan stood, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. A part of him wanted to dismiss the noise, a loose pipe perhaps, or something dislodged by the storm. But curiosity, tempered with unease, compelled him to investigate. He grabbed a flashlight from the counter, its weight oddly comforting in his hand, and moved toward the basement door. It groaned on its hinges as he opened it, revealing the narrow staircase plunging into shadows. The air that wafted up was damp and tinged with something unfamiliar, a faint metallic tang that didn't belong in his home. He descended slowly, each step creaking beneath his weight. The beam of his flashlight cut through the gloom, illuminating the scattered remnants of his former projects. Old machinery, forgotten tools, and dusty crates lined the walls, relics of a time when his work had been more ambitious. Now, they seemed almost like sentinels, standing watch in the dimness. The noise came again, louder this time. A sharp, distinct knock that sent a jolt through him. It was coming from the far corner, near the stack of disused panels he hadn't touched in years. Ethan hesitated, his breath shallow, the flashlight trembling slightly in his grip. "Who's there?" he called, his voice steady but low, swallowed almost immediately by the basement's oppressive quiet. No answer. He edged closer, his movements cautious, every nerve in his body on edge. The beam of light swept across the floor, catching something unexpected, a faint smear of dark liquid leading toward the panels. Blood? He crouched instinctively, his mind racing. The liquid shimmered under the light, not quite the red he expected, but darker, with an iridescent sheen that made it seem almost alive. And then he saw it. A hand. Pale, slender, and inhuman. It jutted out from behind the panels, fingers splayed as if in silent plea or warning. Ethan's stomach twisted, a visceral reaction to the wrongness of the image before him. For a moment, he considered retreating, climbing the stairs two at a time, slamming the door shut, and pretending he'd seen nothing. But something held him there. He reached out and gripped the edge of the panel, its surface cold under his palm. With a sharp pull, he sent it crashing to the side, revealing the figure hidden behind it. She was slumped against the wall, her body partially obscured by shadows. Her skin, pale to the point of translucence, shimmered faintly under the flashlight's beam, as though it reflected more than just light. Her eyes were closed, her chest rising and falling in shallow, uneven breaths. She wore a tattered, unrecognizable garment, its fabric torn and stained with more of the strange, dark liquid. Ethan's mind struggled to make sense of what he was seeing. She wasn't human. That much was clear. The sharp angles of her face, the faint luminescence of her skin, and the slender, elongated fingers spoke of an otherworldly origin. And yet, she wasn't a stranger to pain. Her body bore signs of struggle, bruises blooming like dark flowers along her arms, a deep gash across her side still oozing the iridescent fluid. Her breathing hitched as she stirred, her eyelids fluttering open. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, Ethan's flashlight catching her eyes, a striking, unearthly shade of violet that seemed to pierce straight through him. Her gaze, though weak, held a mix of fear and defiance, as though she were prepared to fight despite her condition. "Don't." Her voice was barely audible, rasping and broken. "Don't call them—" Ethan blinked, his mind reeling. "Them?" His mouth opened to ask, but she collapsed forward, her body going limp as unconsciousness overtook her. The flashlight fell from his hand, clattering to the floor and sending shadows dancing wildly across the walls. And in that moment, with the storm raging above and this alien woman bleeding out in his basement, Ethan Caldwell's world, his quiet, predictable world, began to crack open. Ethan Caldwell didn't sleep that night. The storm had subsided hours ago, leaving behind an eerie stillness that only deepened the unease curling in his chest. In the living room, the faint hum of his old heating unit was the only sound, but his thoughts were anything but quiet. He sat slumped in the worn armchair by the window, staring at the basement door as though it might spring open of its own accord. His hands were still stained, both with the oil he'd been working with earlier and the strange iridescent substance that now streaked across his palms. He'd tried washing it off twice, but the faint shimmer clung stubbornly, a quiet reminder of what lay below. Or rather, who. She hadn't stirred since collapsing. He'd carried her up from the damp, cluttered basement with an awkwardness that felt almost absurd, laying her on the couch with as much care as his trembling hands could muster. Up close, her alienness was even more pronounced. Her skin seemed thinner, more delicate than human skin, with faint traces of what looked like veins glowing softly beneath the surface. Her breathing was shallow but steady, her chest rising and falling with a rhythm that both reassured and unnerved him. Now, sitting across the room, Ethan wrestled with his next move. What do you do when an alien, an injured, possibly dying alien, appears in your basement? Call the authorities? Number that felt wrong. Dangerous, even. If the wrong people found out, what would they do to her? Dissect her? Lock her away in some lab? And who was she hiding from? Her plea echoed in his mind, fragile but insistent. Don't call them. Who the hell are they? He muttered aloud, his voice breaking the stillness. The words hung there for a moment, unanswered, before he shook his head and stood. His legs felt heavy, his movements slow, like he was wading through a nightmare that refused to end. He approached the couch cautiously, as though she might spring to life and attack him. But she remained motionless, her face slack, her alien features strangely serene. Ethan hesitated before kneeling beside her, his eyes scanning her injuries with the clinical detachment he relied on during his engineering work. The wound on her side was the worst of it. The fabric of her clothing had fused with her skin in places, and the fluid leaking from the gash shimmered faintly in the dim light. He wasn't a doctor. Hell, he wasn't even good at first aid, but leaving her like this didn't feel like an option. I'm going to regret this, he muttered, pushing himself to his feet. He rummaged through his supplies, gathering a first aid kit, a basin of water, and a handful of clean towels. The tools felt woefully inadequate for what he was about to attempt, but they were all he had. Kneeling beside her again, Ethan hesitated, his hand hovering just above her arm. She felt so fragile, as though the slightest pressure might shatter her. Taking a steadying breath, he set to work, his fingers moving with the same precision he used on delicate machinery. As he cleaned the wound, her body twitched involuntarily, her head turning slightly toward him. You're okay, he murmured, unsure if she could hear him. You're safe. For now. The phrase felt hollow. Safe. What did that even mean? He didn't know who or what was after her. He didn't know if they were watching him now, their alien tech scanning his every move. Paranoia prickled at the edges of his mind, but he forced it back. Hours passed in a blur of improvised care and quiet observation. The wound, once cleaned, looked less like a tear in flesh and more like damage to something synthetic. Beneath the surface, he glimpsed faintly glowing strands. Veins, perhaps, or some kind of bioengineered tissue. Whatever she wasn't just different. She was something extraordinary. When he finally finished, he slumped back against the armchair, exhaustion washing over him in waves. She seemed stable, at least for now, her breathing more even than before. But as the adrenaline ebbed, a new question clawed its way to the forefront of his mind. What happens when she wakes up? The answer came sooner than he expected. It started with a faint stirring, her fingers twitching against the fabric of the couch. Ethan, half dozing, snapped awake, his heart lurching as her violet eyes fluttered open. She blinked slowly, her gaze unfocused at first, then sharp as a blade. Her body tensed, her hand shooting out to grab his wrist with surprising strength. "Where?" Her voice was a rasp, weak but laced with urgency. "Where am I?" "You're safe," Ethan said quickly, wincing as her grip tightened. "My house. You were hurt. I patched you up." Her eyes narrowed, darting around the room before landing back on him. "Did you call them?" Ethan shook his head. "No one knows you're here. I didn't tell anyone." Her body relaxed slightly, but her hand remained on his wrist, her expression unreadable. "Why?" The question caught him off guard. Why hadn't he called anyone? It would have been the rational thing to do, but as he looked into her eyes, alien yet deeply expressive, he realized he couldn't articulate the answer. "I don't know," he admitted. "You seemed scared, desperate. I guess I didn't want to make things worse." For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, as though weighing his words, she released his wrist and sank back against the couch. "My name," she began, her voice faltering. "Zira." Ethan nodded, the name foreign yet oddly fitting. "Ethan," he replied, unsure if she cared. Her eyes closed briefly, her breathing shallow but steady. When she spoke again, her words sent a chill through him. "They'll come," she said, her tone matter-of-fact, tinged with resignation. "They always do." "Who?" he pressed, leaning forward. "Who's after you?" Zira opened her eyes, and for the first time, Ethan saw fear in their depths, a fear so profound it made his own unease seem trivial. "They're called hunters," she said quietly, "and they won't stop until I'm dead." Ethan's breath caught in his throat, the weight of her words pressing down on him like a physical force. Whatever he'd stumbled into, it was bigger than he'd imagined. And it was only just beginning. The first hint of trouble came with a faint hum, so subtle that Ethan almost dismissed it as his imagination. But Zira's reaction was immediate. Her body stiffened, her eyes snapping open, their violet depths sharp and alert. She sat up too quickly, clutching her side with a wince, her gaze darting to the window. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, her voice tight. Ethan hesitated. "Hear what?" Her head tilted slightly, her expression darkening as the hum grew louder. It was an eerie, unnatural sound that seemed to vibrate in the very air, just on the edge of perception. Ethan felt it more than heard it, a faint pressure behind his ears that made him uneasy. "They've found me," Zira murmured, her voice trembling with certainty. Ethan frowned, adrenaline spiking through him. "Wait, what found you how? You've barely moved from that couch." Zira shot him a sharp look. "The tracker." She ran a hand over her torso, grimacing. "It must still be active." "Tracker?" Ethan stared at her, his mind struggling to keep pace. "You're saying you've been walking around with a beacon this whole time?" "I didn't have a choice," she snapped. "Removing it would have killed me without the proper tools." Before he could respond, a faint metallic clang echoed from outside, cutting through the tension like a blade. Zira's head whipped toward the sound, her expression hardening. "They're here," she said grimly. Ethan's stomach dropped. The basement encounter had been unnerving, but this was something else entirely. He wasn't ready for this, whatever this was. "I don't see anyone," he said, moving cautiously to the window. The night outside was quiet, the storm having left a film of mist clinging to the ground, but as he scanned the darkness, a flicker of movement caught his eye. It was a drone, sleek, silent, and predatory, hovering just above the tree line. Its matte black surface absorbed the moonlight, rendering it nearly invisible save for the faint red glow of its scanning lens. "Damn it," he muttered, stepping back. Zira was already on her feet, swaying slightly as she adjusted to the pain. "They'll have sent more," she said, her tone matter-of-fact. "Drones first, then the hunters. We need to move." "Move where?" Ethan demanded, his voice rising. "They'll track you wherever we go. And in case you forgot, this is my house. What the hell am I supposed to do?" Her gaze softened, just barely. "I didn't mean for this to happen," she said quietly. "But if you stay here, they'll kill you too." Ethan's mind raced, his pulse pounding in his ears. He had no idea who these hunters were or what they were capable of, but he didn't need much imagination to guess they weren't coming for a friendly chat. He took a steadying breath, forcing his thoughts into order. "Okay. You said the tracker's in you, right? Is there any way to disable it without, killing you?" Zira hesitated, her expression conflicted. "Maybe. If we had the right equipment." "What kind of equipment?" She rattled off a list of alien-sounding devices, most of which meant nothing to Ethan. But one word stood out. EM generator. His eyes lit up. "Wait, like an electromagnetic pulse?" Zira nodded. "A strong enough pulse could disable the tracker, temporarily at least." "I can do that," Ethan said, already moving toward his workbench. She blinked. "You can what?" "I can rig an EMP," he said over his shoulder, his hands flying across the cluttered surface as he gathered materials. "I've built them before, for testing equipment, not, intergalactic fugitives. But the principle's the same." Zira stared at him, a flicker of hope breaking through her guarded expression. "How long will it take?" "Not long," he replied, already sketching a crude circuit diagram on a scrap of paper. 10 minutes, maybe." "Make it 5, she said, moving toward the window. "They're getting closer." The hum outside grew louder as Ethan worked, every sound sharpening his focus. His hands moved with practiced precision, soldering wires and piecing together components as though his life depended on it, because, he realized grimly, it probably did. "Done," he said finally, holding up a rough but functional EMP device. Zira turned, her relief evident. "Will it work?" Ethan shrugged. "It'll fry every piece of electronics in a 50-foot radius, including your tracker." "Good enough," she said, motioning for him to follow. They moved quickly to the center of the house, where Zira crouched against the wall, her body tense. Ethan placed the EMP on the floor and stepped back, his finger hovering over the activation switch. "Ready?" he asked. She nodded. The device emitted a sharp, high-pitched whine as it powered up, then released a burst of energy that rippled through the air. Lights flickered and died, plunging the house into darkness. Outside, the drone's red lens blinked out, sending it spiraling into the trees with a crash. Zira exhaled shakily, placing a hand over her side. "It's off. I can't feel it anymore." Ethan's relief was short-lived. From the distance came a new sound, one that set his teeth on edge. Footsteps. "Looks like they're not just relying on tech," he muttered, his voice tight. Zira stood, her posture straight despite the pain. "Then we fight." "Fight?" Ethan stared at her. "With what? I'm an engineer, not some action hero." She glanced at his workbench, where a collection of tools and half-finished projects lay. "Then build something," she said simply. The footsteps grew louder, accompanied by the faint metallic clink of weapons being readied. Ethan swallowed hard, his mind racing. "I really hate today." Zira smirked faintly, her violet eyes glinting in the darkness. "Welcome to my world." As the first shadow appeared at the window, Ethan's hands moved once more, crafting solutions on the edge of desperation. Whatever was coming, it wasn't just Zira's fight anymore. It was theirs. The night felt heavier, thicker somehow, as though the weight of everything Ethan had stumbled into had seeped into the air itself. The EMP had bought them precious moments, but the silence that followed felt more foreboding than the hum of the drones ever had. It was the kind of quiet that came before the strike, before the world came crashing down. Zira was tense, her movements deliberate, but quick as she sifted through Ethan's scattered tools and devices. She pulled a coiled length of copper wiring from the pile, examining it with an intensity that belied the exhaustion still etched across her features. "You really think we're fighting our way out of this?" Ethan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "We don't have a choice," Zira said flatly, tossing the wire aside. "They'll be inside within minutes, and they won't hesitate. You think your life doesn't matter to them just because you didn't mean to get involved?" She paused, her gaze locking onto his. "They'll kill you anyway. Loose ends don't survive the hunters." He wanted to argue, to say she was wrong, that there had to be another way, but deep down he knew she was right. Whatever these hunters were, whoever they worked for, they weren't here to talk. "What about you?" he asked. "You've clearly done this before. You've survived them." She hesitated, her hand brushing over her side where the now disabled tracker had been. "I survived," she admitted, "but not without help, and not without loss." The unspoken weight in her voice hit Ethan harder than he expected, and for a brief moment, the hard-edged warrior standing before him gave way to something more fragile. "Who helped you?" he asked cautiously, not sure if he was prying too far. Zira didn't answer immediately. Instead, she turned back to the window, her silhouette outlined against the faint glow of the mist outside. "Mara," she said finally. "She's the reason I made it this far." "Is she—" Ethan let the question trail off, unsure how to finish it. "Alive?" Zira's tone was unreadable. "I don't know." She turned back to him, her expression unreadable. "The hunters don't leave much behind when they're done." Ethan swallowed hard, unsure what to say. The flicker of vulnerability in her voice felt like a thread he shouldn't pull, not when every second felt like a countdown to chaos. "They're here," she said suddenly, her body tensing. Ethan froze, his ears straining to pick up the sound. At first, he heard nothing. Then, faintly, the unmistakable creak of wood under pressure. The porch. The first impact came not at the door, but at the window. A sharp, deliberate strike that shattered the glass and sent shards cascading to the floor. Ethan barely had time to react before a dark figure dropped into the room, moving with a precision and grace that was anything but human. The hunter was tall and lean, its body encased in sleek obsidian armor that seemed to shift and ripple in the dim light. Its face, or what passed for one, was a blank reflective visor that gave no hint of the creature underneath. Zira moved first. In an instant, she was on the hunter, her movements a blur of speed and calculated force. Her fists struck with precision, targeting the weak points in its armor, but the hunter responded in kind, its fluid motions matching hers, blow for blow. Ethan stood frozen, his mind struggling to process the surreal sight before him. Then another crash shattered his paralysis. The door burst open, and two more hunters stepped inside, their weapons humming with lethal intent. "Damn it," Ethan hissed, his body finally catching up with his brain. He grabbed the nearest object, a heavy wrench, and hurled it at the closest hunter. It connected with a loud clang, momentarily staggering the figure, but doing little real damage. "Stay back!" Zira shouted, her voice sharp as she ducked beneath a strike and drove her elbow into her opponent's torso. "You're no good to me dead." "Working on it," Ethan shouted back, diving behind the workbench as one of the new hunters turned toward him. His hands flew across the cluttered surface, searching for anything that could be turned into a weapon. He grabbed a small, half-finished device, an arc welder he'd been tinkering with, and yanked the wires free. The hunter advanced, its weapon raised, but Ethan didn't wait. He thrust the makeshift welder forward, pressing the activation switch. A burst of electricity arced from the device, striking the hunter square in the chest. The creature spasmed, its body locking up as the electrical surge coursed through it. Ethan didn't wait to see if it would recover. He grabbed the nearest chair and swung it with all his strength, sending the hunter crashing to the ground. "Ethan!" Zira's voice cut through the chaos. He turned to see her grappling with two hunters at once, her movements growing slower, more labored. Despite her skill, it was clear she was reaching her limit. "Hold on!" he shouted, grabbing another tool, a metal pipe this time, and rushing toward her. Together, they fought back the advancing hunters, their movements an uneasy synchronization of desperation and determination. Ethan wasn't a fighter, and his strikes were clumsy compared to Zira's precise blows, but he managed to hold his own, if only barely. The tide turned when Zira landed a devastating strike against one hunter, sending it crashing into the wall with enough force to crack its visor. She turned to Ethan, her breath ragged, but her eyes blazing. "Go to the basement," she ordered. "What? Why?" "Just do it." Something in her voice left no room for argument. Ethan nodded and bolted toward the basement door, his heart pounding as he descended the stairs 2 at a time. When he reached the bottom, he stopped short, his eyes widening in disbelief. There, hidden beneath a tarp in the far corner, was something he hadn't seen before. It was a device, sleek, alien, and unmistakably out of place among the clutter of his tools and machinery. "What the hell is this?" he muttered, moving closer. The device pulsed faintly, its surface etched with symbols he couldn't begin to decipher. It felt alive, almost as though it were waiting for something, or someone. "Ethan!" Zira's voice came from above, sharp and urgent. "Activate it!" "What does it do?" he shouted back. "It's our only chance." Ethan hesitated for only a second before reaching out. His fingers brushed against the device, and it came alive, the pulsing light intensifying as it emitted a low, resonant hum. From above came a sudden, blinding flash of light, followed by silence. Ethan's heart raced as he climbed back up the stairs, his mind spinning with questions. When he reached the top, he froze. The hunters were gone. Zira stood in the center of the room, her body tense, her expression unreadable as she stared at the now empty space where their enemies had been. "What just happened?" Ethan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Zira turned to him, her gaze heavy with something he couldn't quite place. "You activated a beacon," she said quietly, "and now they know where we are." Ethan's stomach dropped. "Who knows?" "The Resistance," she replied, her voice steady but grim. "But so does Voss." The air in the clearing was still, heavy with anticipation. Shadows danced across the uneven ground as faint beams of moonlight broke through the canopy of trees. The beacon hummed faintly in Ethan's bag, its alien energy coursing through the circuits he could barely comprehend. Ethan tightened his grip on the makeshift weapon in his hand, a length of reinforced piping, outfitted with a sparking electrical coil at its tip. Around them, the world seemed to hold its breath. Zira stood beside him, her frame taut with a warrior's focus. Her violet eyes flickered toward him, unreadable but steady. "They'll be here soon," she said quietly. "I figured," Ethan replied, swallowing the lump in his throat. "What's the plan?" Zira hesitated. It was subtle, but enough for Ethan to notice. "We hold our ground," she said finally. "The Resistance will come, but not before Voss's forces do. We have to buy them time." Ethan's mind reeled. The name Voss carried a weight he didn't yet fully understand, but the dread in Zira's voice was enough to make it real. "And what happens if we don't hold?" he asked. She looked at him, her expression softening just slightly. "We will." The first sign of their arrival came as a distant ripple in the air, a low hum that felt more like a vibration in Ethan's chest than a sound. Zira turned toward the noise, her stance shifting imperceptibly, like a predator sensing its prey. "They're here," she murmured. Ethan followed her gaze. From the tree line, figures emerged, silent and deliberate. The hunters moved with an eerie synchronicity, their sleek black armor catching faint glints of light as they spread out in formation. Behind them came a figure unlike the others, Voss. Even without Zira's whispered confirmation, Ethan knew it was him. The tyrant's presence was oppressive, his towering form clad in a crystalline armor that seemed to shimmer with its own inner light. His face was hidden behind a translucent mask, his eyes cold and calculating. "Zira of Valara," Voss called, his voice deep and resonant. "How far you've fallen." Zira stepped forward, her shoulders square, her chin lifted defiantly. "I've fallen, yes," she said, her voice steady, "but I'm still standing." You should worry about that. Voss chuckled, a sound devoid of warmth. Bravado suits you, though it won't save you. Surrender now, and I may consider mercy. For your people, if not for you. Ethan glanced at Zira, expecting anger, but instead found her smiling, a small, dangerous curve of her lips. You never understood my people, she said softly, and that's why you'll lose. Voss raised a hand, signaling his hunters forward. We'll see. The first clash was brutal. Zira moved with a grace Ethan could only describe as otherworldly, her strikes precise and devastating. She wielded a short blade she'd salvaged earlier, its edges glowing faintly with alien energy. Every movement was purposeful, her training and experience evident in the way she danced through the chaos. Ethan, by contrast, fought with desperation and raw determination. His improvised weapons sparked with each swing, discharging jolts of electricity that staggered the hunters when they got too close. He wasn't a warrior, but necessity made him quick, resourceful, and relentless. The hunters, however, were relentless too. For every one they brought down, two more seemed to take its place. They're not stopping, Ethan shouted, his voice hoarse. They don't need to, Zira replied, panting. They only have to outlast us. Ethan's heart sank. He could see the strain in her movements now, the exhaustion creeping in despite her best efforts. Then what's the point? He asked, his frustration boiling over. Zira turned to him, her expression fierce. The point is to prove them wrong. The tide shifted when the beacon activated. Ethan had almost forgotten about it in the chaos, but its sudden pulse of light drew everyone's attention. The hunters hesitated, their movements faltering as the beacon's hum grew louder. What's happening? Ethan asked, shielding his eyes. Zira's gaze remained fixed on the beacon. The resistance is coming. True to her word, a moment later, the sky above them lit up with streaks of fiery light. Ships, sleek and angular, bearing the unmistakable markings of Valara's resistance, descended into the clearing, their weapons blazing. The hunters turned their focus to the new threat, their formation breaking as chaos erupted. Voss, however, remained still, his gaze locked on Zira. This isn't over, he said, his voice low and dangerous. Zira stepped toward him, her blade raised. It ends here. The battle between Zira and Voss was unlike anything Ethan had ever seen. They moved with a speed and precision that defied belief, their strikes sending shockwaves through the air. Voss's crystalline armor glowed with an unnatural energy, absorbing and redirecting Zira's attacks with devastating force. But Zira didn't falter. She fought with a ferocity born of years of pain, loss, and determination. Each strike carried the weight of her people's suffering, her movements driven by a singular purpose, to end Voss's reign. Ethan watched, helpless but captivated, as the two warriors clashed. He wanted to help, but this fight was beyond him. Finally, with a desperate, calculated strike, Zira found her opening. Her blade pierced the crystalline armor, striking true. Voss staggered, his hand clutching at the wound as his mask cracked, revealing a face twisted with rage and disbelief. You've lost, he gasped, his voice fading. Zira stepped back, her blade slick with his blood. No, she said softly. You did. With a final gasp, Voss collapsed, his body crumpling like a broken statue. The aftermath was a blur. The resistance forces secured the area, rounding up the remaining hunters and tending to the wounded. Zira, though battered and bruised, stood tall amidst the chaos, her presence commanding. Ethan approached her cautiously, unsure of what to say. It's over, he said finally. Zira turned to him, her expression softening. For now. What happens next? He asked. She looked to the horizon, where the first hints of dawn were breaking through the trees. I go home, she said simply. There's still so much to rebuild. Ethan hesitated. And me? Her gaze returned to him, a small smile playing on her lips. That's your choice. He thought about his quiet life, the one he'd left behind when Zira stumbled into it. And then he thought about everything he'd seen, everything he'd done since. I think, he said slowly, I'm ready for something new. Zira nodded, as though she'd expected nothing less. Then let's go, she said. As the resistance ships rose into the sky, carrying them toward an uncertain but hopeful future, Ethan couldn't help but smile. For the first time in years, he felt alive.